The conference room smelled of fresh paint and nervous sweat. 23 Russian activists sat in folding chairs at the Riga training workshop, notebooks open, eager to learn about fundraising strategies from their Western partners. None of them noticed the young man in the third row, the one who asked slightly too many questions about internal procedures. His name was Dmitry Volkov. At least, that was the name on his Latvian student ID, the one purchased through a compromised university administrative clerk for 300 euros. The real Dmitry Volkov was studying engineering in Tallinn, completely unaware his identity had been borrowed for the weekend. The fake Dmitry leaned forward, his pen hovering over blank paper. The German Foundation representative was explaining grant application processes, and he watched the room carefully. Who leaned in with interest? Who exchanged knowing glances? Who looked uncomfortable when the topic of transparency came up? His phone buzzed once against his thigh. The handler in St. Petersburg wanted an update. Not yet. The most valuable intelligence always came in the final 30 minutes, when defenses dropped and people started asking the questions they'd been holding back all day. A woman 2 seats over raised her hand. Marina something. She worked for a democracy promotion NGO in Moscow, funded by Open Society. She'd been taking notes aggressively all morning. "What about organizations that receive funding from multiple sources?" Marina asked. "How do we manage reporting requirements when donors have different metrics?" Perfect. The fake Dmitry smiled and added her name to his mental list. Multiple funding streams meant multiple vulnerabilities. It meant complexity. And complexity meant opportunities for the FSB to insert themselves into the financial architecture. The workshop leader answered, and Dmitry let the conversation flow around him. 40 minutes left in the session. Then the evening reception, where alcohol would loosen tongues further. Then a quiet exit across the Estonian border, using a different crossing point than his arrival. By Monday morning, his handler would have complete psychological profiles of 17 potential recruitment targets, and Marina's NGO would have an invisible FSB shadow following its money. His hand moved to the phone in his pocket. Time to send that update. Time to feed another name into the machine that Felix Dzerzhinsky built a century ago, and Vladimir Putin had resurrected from Lubyanka's archives. The ghost network was growing, one helpful young volunteer at a time. Before we find out what intelligence Dmitry extracted from that workshop, I want to let you know about what this channel offers. Every single day, we bring you real spy stories pulled from actual operations, genuine tradecraft used by intelligence services around the world, and the human cost behind covert action. Not Hollywood fantasies, but the actual mechanics of how intelligence operations work and why they matter. If you're fascinated by the invisible war happening in the shadows of geopolitics, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. What you're about to hear about Operation Trust 2 will change how you see every opposition movement and every dissident voice in authoritative regimes. Oh, and real quick, before we dive back in, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment below with your city and country. It's always fascinating to see how far these intelligence stories reach. Are you listening from London, Istanbul, Tokyo? Let me know. Now, back to Riga, where Dmitry's phone was vibrating with increasing urgency. He excused himself to the bathroom, locked the stall door, and typed rapidly on the encrypted messaging app. The messages would route through 3 proxy servers before reaching the FSB facility in St. Petersburg, appearing to outside observers as routine traffic to a university library database. Targets identified 17. Primary, Marina Kozlov, Opensos, Moscow. Secondary, Alexei Rybakov, Human Rights Watch liaison. Tertiary, 15 others, full profiles ready for upload at 2200 HRS. Vulnerability assessment. Kozlov emotional about funding stress. Rybakov shows ego sensitivity, both recruitable within 90 days. The handler's response came within seconds. Good work. Extend stay 24 HRS. Target evening social. Priority, map personal relationships. Dmitry deleted the exchange and flushed. The operation was proceeding exactly as planned. But to understand why this worked so well, and why Marina Kozlov was already compromised before she even knew Dmitri's fake name, we need to go back 80 years to a snow-covered Moscow street and a conversation between two men who understood that controlling your enemies is better than killing them. December 1921. The Russian Civil War was ending, but the Bolsheviks faced a different kind of threat. Tens of thousands of white Russian émigrés had scattered across Europe, plotting revenge, organizing resistance networks, and maintaining contact with anti-Soviet elements still inside Russia. The newly formed Cheka, the predecessor to the KGB and later the FSB, had a problem. You can shoot dissidents inside your borders, but how do you neutralize threats that operate from Paris, London, and Prague? Felix Dzerzhinsky, the Cheka's founder, sat in his Lubyanka office studying this exact question. A former Polish revolutionary with a reputation for ruthless efficiency, Dzerzhinsky understood something fundamental about human psychology. People don't trust their enemies, but they absolutely trust their friends, so he created friends for the white émigrés to trust. The operation was called the Trust, and it was devastatingly simple in concept. The Cheka established a fake anti-Bolshevik resistance organization inside Soviet Russia called the Monarchist Union of Central Russia. They staffed it with a mix of genuine anti-Bolsheviks who'd been turned and Cheka officers playing roles. The front company was the Moscow Municipal Credit Association, which gave the whole network a legitimate business cover. The key to the operation was Alexander Yakushev, a former bureaucrat from Imperial Russia's Ministry of Communications. After the revolution, he'd joined the People's Commissariat of Foreign Trade, which allowed him to travel abroad and make contact with émigré leaders. When the Cheka arrested him for those contacts, they offered him a choice: work for us or die. Yakushev chose survival. He became the Trust's public face, traveling across Europe and convincing white Russian leaders that a powerful underground movement was preparing to overthrow the Bolsheviks from within. All they needed was patience. Wait for the internal resistance to grow stronger. Don't launch premature attacks. Trust the process. General Alexander Kutepov, a hardline monarchist who'd been organizing militant action against the Soviets, was convinced to stand down. The Trust fed him just enough accurate intelligence to prove their legitimacy, mixed with strategic disinformation that kept him waiting for a moment that would never come. The operation's greatest successes came when the Trust lured prominent émigrés back into Soviet territory. Boris Savinkov, a former revolutionary and minister in the transitional Kerensky government, crossed the border in August 1924 to meet with Trust operatives. He was arrested immediately and forced into a show trial where he confessed his crimes. Sidney Riley, the British intelligence agent later immortalized as Ace of Spies, crossed the Finnish-Soviet frontier in September 1925 for a Trust meeting. He was never seen again. But the Trust's real victory wasn't capturing individual targets. It was the systematic mapping and neutralization of the entire white émigré network. Every person who contacted the Trust revealed their contacts inside Russia. Every meeting exposed another layer of the opposition's structure. The Cheka didn't just identify monarchists and anti-Bolsheviks, they controlled the entire information ecosystem the opposition relied upon. The Trust ran for 6 years, from 1921 to 1927, expanding to hundreds of agents and thousands of participants. When Western historian John Costello finally gained limited access to the Trust files in 1993, he reported they comprised 37 volumes of such bewildering complexity, with double agents, changed code names, and interlocking deception operations, that even Russian intelligence historians had difficulty separating fact from fantasy. The complexity itself became a weapon. When the Trust was finally exposed in 1927, probably deliberately by the Soviets themselves, the damage to the émigré movement was catastrophic. Everyone who'd worked with the Trust was discredited. Real resistance networks collapsed under mutual suspicion. Western intelligence services, who'd been funding Trust-connected groups, withdrew their support from all Russian opposition activities. The Soviets achieved their ultimate goal, making every dissident suspect every opposition claim questionable, every resistance effort doomed by paranoia. The trust files were archived in the Lubyanka's special collections, studied by every subsequent generation of Soviet intelligence officers as the gold standard of counterintelligence operations. Jump forward to May 2000. Vladimir Putin, a former KGB officer who'd spent his career studying cases like the Trust, signed a decree placing the FSB under direct presidential control. He knew those archives. He knew that playbook. And he looked at the landscape of post-Soviet Russia and saw the same problem Dzerzhinsky had faced 80 years earlier. Liberal NGOs funded by Western foundations, Russian diaspora communities in Europe organizing opposition activities, Chechen exile networks raising money and running messaging campaigns, pro-Western reformists. Inside Russian business and bureaucracy, think tanks lobbying for reduced European energy dependence on Russia. Foreign intelligence services recruiting in all these circles. The question wasn't whether to suppress these groups. The question was how to control them. In a conference room deep inside Lubyanka, FSB Directorate O, responsible for counterintelligence and internal opposition targeting, began drafting what would become known internally as Operation Trust II. Not a single operation, but a comprehensive program applying 1920 as methodology to 21 century opposition movements. The objectives were clear. Penetrate foreign-funded NGO ecosystems, particularly those linked to George Soros's Open Society Foundations, German political foundations, and Scandinavian civil society networks. Map financial flows to Russian dissidents and compile vulnerability portfolios on every significant activist. Create false flag dissident groups to attract real activists into FSB-controlled spaces. Neutralize Chechen exile fundraising and messaging networks across Turkey, Georgia, and Western Europe. Shape European energy policy discussions by infiltrating think tanks and policy groups. And perhaps most cleverly, seed the intelligence landscape with controlled whistleblowers to overwhelm foreign services with noise and discredit real defectors. The structure mirrored the original Trust, but adapted for modern conditions. Directorate O handled domestic recruitment, friendly NGOs, and false dissident fronts. Directorate S, the FSB's illegals program, provided deep cover operatives for European penetrations, supported by SVR line PR for political influence operations. GRU ran a parallel but coordinated effort targeting the Chechen diaspora. And critically, local European nodes in Prague, Warsaw, Vienna, Berlin, Riga, and Istanbul served as collector hubs where intelligence flowed back to Moscow. The Tradecraft had evolved, but the principles remained unchanged. In 2003, an FSB planning document laid out the gatekeeper asset method. Instead of trying to surveil an entire diaspora community or opposition network, you insert a single trusted personality who becomes the mediator, the information filter, the safe handler of funds, and the moral authority everyone respects. This gatekeeper quietly steers all influence back to the FSB node without anyone realizing the entire network is compromised. Marina Kozlov, sitting in that Riga training session with the fake Dmitry Volkov, didn't know she was 3 steps away from a gatekeeper asset. Her NGO's funding came through a regional coordinator in Warsaw, who seemed like exactly the kind of dedicated pro-democracy activist you'd want managing your grants. What Marina didn't know was that the coordinator had been recruited by the FSB 2 years earlier during a particularly difficult divorce, when financial pressure and emotional vulnerability created the perfect opening. Every grant application Marina submitted went through that coordinator. Every strategic decision her NGO made was discussed with that coordinator. Every activist Marina introduced to the network was quietly cataloged by that coordinator and entered into FSB databases. The fake Dmitry's job wasn't to recruit Marina directly, it was to identify her vulnerabilities so the Warsaw coordinator could exploit them later. Emotional stress about funding? Note it. Ego sensitivity about her organization's importance? Note it. Complicated relationships with other activists? Note it. Every psychological detail became ammunition for later manipulation. This was the invisible architecture of Trust II. Not dramatic spy versus spy confrontations, but patient, systematic penetration of the opposition's information bloodstream. By 2004, the operation had achieved penetration of at least a dozen major NGOs operating in Russia and Eastern Europe. The FSB didn't shut them down. That would have been crude and obvious. Instead, they let the NGOs continue their work, monitored everything they did, identified everyone they contacted, and occasionally steered their activities in directions that served Russian interests. The genius of the approach was its sustainability. Traditional surveillance requires massive resources and generates evidence that can be detected. But if you control the trusted intermediaries, the opposition surveils itself. They report their activities voluntarily, believing they're reporting to allies. They expose their networks willingly, thinking they're building coalitions. They reveal their strategies openly, assuming they're among friends. The fake Dmitry Volkov returned to the workshop as the afternoon session began. The topic had shifted to digital security, and he watched with quiet amusement as the workshop leader explained encrypted communications and secure file sharing. The activists nodded seriously, taking notes about tools they believed would protect them from FSB surveillance. None of them understood that the real vulnerability wasn't their digital communications. It was the person sitting 3 seats away who'd seemed so helpful, so dedicated to the cause, so trustworthy. The person who'd volunteered to coordinate secure channels, who'd offer to manage contact lists, who'd become the hub everyone relied upon. That evening's reception took place in a renovated warehouse with exposed brick walls and cheap wine. Dmitry nursed a single glass for 2 hours while mapping the social network. Who gravitated towards whom? Who avoided whom? Who dominated conversations and who listened quietly? The FSB's pre-social media profiling system relied heavily on what they called body language cluster analysis. Position yourself at the edge of a group photo and watch who stands next to whom. Note who leans in during conversations and who maintains distance. Track who makes eye contact frequently and who avoids it. Dmitry pulled out his phone and snapped what appeared to be a casual group selfie with activists in the background. Later, FSB analysts would examine the positioning, the proximity, the physical dynamics. They'd built psychological profiles based on such photos for years, long before Facebook and Instagram made the work easier. Marina approached him around 8 o'clock, wine glass in hand, clearly several drinks ahead of him. "You asked good questions today," she said, "about the funding transparency issues." Dmitry smiled modestly. "I'm just trying to understand how organizations like yours manage so many moving parts. It seems impossibly complex." "It is," Marina admitted. And then she began talking about donor requirements that contradicted each other, about reporting burdens that consumed half her staff's time, about the constant fear that a single accounting error could cost them everything, about the other NGOs she didn't quite trust, the activists who seemed more interested in publicity than results, the Western Foundation officers who didn't understand conditions on the ground in Russia. Dmitry listened, asked sympathetic questions, and mentally cataloged every detail. 15 minutes of wine-loosened conversation revealed more than 6 hours of formal workshop attendance. This was exactly why the FSB sent him. At 9:30, he excused himself, claiming an early morning class in Tallinn. He walked 4 blocks to a different hostel than the one where he'd checked in, retrieved a backpack from a rented locker, and caught a bus to the Estonian border. He crossed using a completely different ID than his entry documents, a Russian passport in yet another name. Border security never questioned the engineering student returning home from a weekend visiting Tallinn nightclubs. By Monday morning, Dmitry's handler in St. Petersburg had received an encrypted file containing psychological profiles of 17 targets, photographs with body language analysis, and a detailed map of NGO interpersonal dynamics. The fake Dmitry Volkov's student ID was destroyed. The Latvian administrative clerk was paid another 300 euros, and the real Dmitry Volkov in Tallinn never knew his identity had been borrowed for an intelligence operation. Marina Kozlov returned to Moscow, believing she'd attended a useful workshop and met some dedicated fellow activists. She had no idea she'd just been entered into an FSB vulnerability database that would follow her for the next decade. This was Operation Trust 2 in action. No dramatic arrests, no public exposures, just invisible penetration spreading through opposition networks like a slow-acting poison. The Chechen dimension of Trust 2 operated under different rules, but with the same underlying logic. The 100,000-member Chechen diaspora scattered across Europe after two brutal wars in the 1990s and early 2000s represented both a threat and an opportunity for Russian intelligence. Istanbul became one of the FSB's most valuable operational hubs for Chechen targeting. The city hosted thousands of Chechen refugees and exiles, many maintaining contact with resistance elements still operating in the Caucasus. The FSB developed what internal documents called the Pilgrim Passports Ring, a network that issued fake religious travel documents to manipulate exile movement patterns and track anti-Kremlin imams. The operation worked through sympathetic contacts inside Turkey's religious bureaucracy and certain mosques. Chechens seeking documentation for travel to Saudi Arabia for religious pilgrimage would approach fixers who claimed to expedite the process. What they didn't know was that some of these fixers worked for the FSB, or more accurately, worked for intermediaries who ultimately reported to an FSB officer operating under Turkish business cover in Istanbul. The documents themselves were genuine. The FSB had penetrated parts of the actual issuance system. But every application was photocopied, every applicant was photographed, and the information flowed back to Moscow. The FSB built comprehensive databases of who traveled when, who they met, what mosques they attended, which imams they respected. More insidiously, the network allowed the FSB to track diaspora movement patterns. If a Chechen exile in Vienna suddenly applied for travel documents to Turkey, it suggested possible operational activity. Cross-reference that with similar applications from Chechens in other European cities, and you could map an emerging network before it even solidified. The infiltration of Chechen communities relied heavily on family and clan vulnerabilities. Chechen society is structured around teeps, clan networks that carry obligations and loyalties across generations. The FSB identified key TAP leaders in European diaspora communities and applied pressure through family members still living in Chechnya or under Russian-controlled Chechen administration. A Chechen exile leader in Austria might receive a phone call from Grozny. His elderly mother's pension had been suspended pending a routine review, or his cousin's business license was being questioned due to alleged tax irregularities. Nothing explicit, no direct threats, just gentle reminders that actions in Vienna had consequences in Chechnya. Some exile leaders resisted. They understood the game. But others couldn't bear the thought of family suffering because of their activism. They'd start making small accommodations, tone down the rhetoric, skip certain protests, share a little information about other activists, nothing too important, just enough to protect family back home. These small accommodations were exactly what the FSB wanted. Not complete control, just enough influence to keep the diaspora divided, suspicious of each other, and ineffective at organizing serious resistance. Ramzan Kadyrov, the FSB-backed Chechen leader who'd fought against Russia during the First Chechen War before switching sides, repeatedly issued public invitations for exiles to return home. In February 2009, he met with a representative of the Chechen diaspora in Europe and promised that the situation had stabilized, that returnees would be welcomed, that families would be reunited. Some Chechens did return. A few found the forgiveness they'd been promised. Others disappeared into Chechnya's invisible network of detention facilities. The uncertainty itself served FSB interests. Come home, and maybe you'll be safe. Maybe you won't. The ambiguity kept the diaspora fractured between those who trusted Kadyrov's offers and those who saw them as traps. The FSB also ran more sophisticated operations targeting Chechen intellectual and political leadership. In European capitals, FSB illegals posed as sympathetic journalists, human rights researchers, and academic specialists on Caucasus affairs. They'd approach Chechen exile leaders, offering to help document war crimes, preserve testimony, or publish analysis of Russian abuses. These approaches seemed legitimate because they often were legitimate. The FSB used a tactic called noise cloaking, where assets deliberately behaved somewhat incompetently to avoid seeming like professional operatives. A researcher who missed meetings occasionally, who made minor factual errors in preliminary reports, who seemed genuinely passionate but slightly disorganized. This person didn't set off alarm bells the way a too perfect operative would. Over months of contact, the researcher would gather detailed information about exile network structures, leadership dynamics, funding sources, and strategic plans. Much of this information would be published in genuine academic papers or human rights reports. The FSB didn't care about the publication. They cared about the intelligence collected during the research process. By 2006, FSB targeting of the Chechen diaspora had achieved significant penetration of fundraising networks, split political leadership between pro-Kadyrov and anti-Kadyrov factions, and created such deep suspicion within exile communities that organizing coherent resistance became nearly impossible. The most cynical aspect of the operation came after 2013, when the Syrian civil war created a new outlet for Chechen militants. FSB agents in Dagestan began actively facilitating the travel of suspected fighters to Syria via Turkey. As one FSB officer explained to a journalist, "Everyone's happy. They're dying on the path of Allah, and we have no terrorist acts here." The FSB simultaneously tracked these fighters, monitored their communications, and used their departure to claim success in counterterrorism, while also gathering intelligence on foreign jihadist networks. Some fighters who survived Syria and attempted to return to Russia were arrested at the border with detailed files already prepared about their activities abroad. The Chechen diaspora had become, in effect, a controlled experimental environment where the FSB could test recruitment techniques, track radicalization patterns, and refine its understanding of how exile communities functioned under pressure. But perhaps the most sophisticated element of Trust II operated in a sphere most people never think about when they imagine espionage, academic and policy research. Western think tanks and universities studying Russia and Eastern Europe became prime FSB targets not for traditional espionage, but for narrative shaping. The FSB developed what internal documents called the Academic Ghost Arm, a ghostwriting cell that produced papers and analysis for foreign researchers to publish under their own names. The mechanism was subtle. An FSB illegal working as a research fellow at a European think tank would strike up a friendship with a Western Russia specialist. Over drinks, they'd discuss various aspects of Russian politics, energy policy, or regional security. The illegal would mention having contacts inside Russia who could provide insider perspective or access to interesting data. The Western researcher, always hungry for unique sources and original information, would express interest. The illegal would arrange introductions, facilitate interviews, and occasionally provide written briefing materials from these contacts. The briefing materials were well-researched, fact-heavy, and sophisticated. They contained real information mixed with carefully crafted framing that advanced FSB narrative interests. The Western researcher would incorporate these insights into their work, usually paraphrasing, but sometimes quoting directly from the briefing materials. Their published analysis would then carry FSB-influenced perspectives, but with the credibility of an independent Western expert. Several high-profile opinion pieces published between 2003 and 2007, arguing that Russia was misunderstood by the West, or that European energy policy toward Russia was unnecessarily confrontational, were later linked to FSB ghostwriting operations. The researchers who published them had no idea they were amplifying FSB talking points. They believed they were offering nuanced, informed analysis based on privileged access to Russian sources. The FSB even tracked what Western-funded Russian scholars were reading abroad through what they called library agents. FSB operatives would target librarians and research assistants at major European universities, paying them small amounts to provide metadata about which books Russian scholars checked out, which databases they accessed, which topics they researched. This information allowed the FSB to map ideological drift among Russian academics working abroad. A researcher who started checking out books on democratic transitions or civil society development might be flagged for recruitment attempts or neutralization operations. The library metadata created an early warning system for detecting which scholars might become problematic. The infiltration went deeper still. Some FSB assets took volunteer-level positions at German political foundations, not senior roles, but student volunteer positions managing mailing lists, organizing events, and handling administrative work. These positions gave them access to contact databases, strategic planning documents, and informal conversations among foundation leadership. The FSB didn't need moles in senior positions. Junior staff who managed email distribution lists could identify every Russian civil society leader receiving foundation support. Event coordinators who handled travel arrangements could map meeting patterns and identify which activists met with which Western officials. One of the lesser-known Trust II components involved using energy sector intermediaries to shape European debates about pipeline dependency. The FSB recruited consultants and analysts working for oil and gas companies doing business in Russia. These intermediaries would inject leads into Brussels policy discussions, posing as neutral industry experts while subtly steering conversations toward conclusions favorable to Russian interests. A consultant might testify before a European Parliament committee about the technical infeasibility of diversifying away from Russian gas supplies, or an industry analyst might publish reports emphasizing the reliability of Russian energy partnerships. These interventions carried weight because they came from ostensibly independent commercial sources, not Russian government officials. The cumulative effect was a dense web of influence operations that shaped how Western institutions understood Russia, how policy was formulated, and how opposition movements were supported. By 2007, Operation Trust II had achieved penetration across multiple vectors. NGO ecosystems compromised through gatekeeper assets, Chechen diaspora networks split and surveilled, academic research subtly influenced, and energy policy debates shaped by FSB-connected intermediaries. The operation succeeded not through any single dramatic success, but through patient, systematic corruption of the opposition's information ecosystem. Then came the complications. No intelligence operation remains invisible forever. The first cracks in Trust II appeared not through Western counterintelligence, but through financial analysis. A Lithuanian banking oversight officer noticed unusual patterns in transactions flowing through a small Riga bank to Russian NGOs. Money would arrive from Western foundations, pass through intermediate accounts, and then small percentages would flow back out to shell companies registered in Cyprus and Montenegro. The pattern suggested money laundering, but when investigators looked closer, they found something stranger. The shell companies had no apparent business purpose, existed only on paper, and seemed to exist solely to create circular transaction patterns. The Lithuanian officer shared the findings with European banking regulators, who began examining similar patterns across multiple jurisdictions. Western intelligence services started paying attention. If you mapped the flow of foundation money to Russian NGOs and then traced the outflow to shell companies, certain names appeared repeatedly as intermediaries. Those intermediaries were exactly the kind of trusted coordinators and program managers who'd positioned themselves as essential nodes in opposition funding networks. The FSB had been so focused on penetration that they'd been sloppy about financial tradecraft. The circular flows that seemed clever, using Western money to fund the operation targeting Western-funded activists, created patterns that sophisticated analysis could detect. A second vulnerability emerged from FSB's success itself. The organization had seeded so many fake whistleblowers and controlled defectors into Western intelligence channels that the volume of contradictory information became suspicious. When 3 different sources provide 3 incompatible accounts of the same event, the problem isn't just determining which is true. The problem is recognizing that someone might be deliberately flooding the zone with conflicting information. By 2008, CIA counterintelligence officers had identified the pattern. too many Russian sources with too good access, providing too specific information that always turned out to be partially true and partially false. The mixture of real and fake intelligence was itself a signature. Someone was running an active saturation campaign. The third crack came from Ukrainian intelligence services, particularly after the 2014 Maidan Revolution brought a pro-Western government to power. Ukrainian services had their own experience with Russian penetration operations and started sharing their methodology with European partners. They'd developed techniques for identifying gatekeeper assets by analyzing communication patterns within opposition networks. If one person's communications touched an unusually high percentage of network nodes, if they were consistently present at critical meetings, if they volunteered for coordination roles disproportionately, they merited additional scrutiny. Combined with financial pattern analysis, this approach helped identify several Trust 2 assets operating in Eastern European NGO networks. But here's where Operation Trust 2 revealed its true strategic depth. Even after these penetrations were exposed, the operation succeeded. When the first gatekeeper assets were identified and quietly removed from opposition networks in 2008 and 2009, the FSB didn't panic. They'd studied what happened when the original trust was exposed in 1927. The operation's greatest victory came after it ended. The exposure created exactly what the FSB wanted: paranoia, suspicion, and collapse of trust within opposition movements. Once activists learned that some of their most trusted coordinators had been FSB assets, they began suspecting everyone. Productive opposition networks fractured into hostile factions. Western foundations became more cautious about funding Russian civil society, worried their money was feeding FSB operations. The FSB achieved through exposure what they could never have achieved through concealment: the complete paralysis of opposition organizing capacity through mutual suspicion. A Russian democracy activist who'd worked with one of the exposed gatekeeper assets described the aftermath to a Western journalist. "We spent 6 months trying to figure out who else might be compromised. We stopped sharing real information at meetings. We assumed every email was monitored, every phone call was recorded, every new volunteer was a potential FSB plant. We became so focused on security that we stopped doing actual activism. The FSB won by making us afraid of each other." This was the ghost of Felix Dzerzhinsky's operation living through modern descendants. The FSB had studied those 37 volumes of trust files and learned the central lesson: controlled opposition beats eliminated opposition, but exposed controlled opposition beats everything. Let me pause here and ask you something that I think gets to the heart of this operation's moral complexity. The FSB identified real opposition activists, people genuinely trying to promote democracy and human rights in Russia, and systematically destroyed their ability to trust each other or organize effectively. They didn't arrest them. They didn't kill them. They just made it impossible for them to work together. If you were a Western intelligence officer who discovered this operation, would you expose it, knowing that exposure would achieve the FSB's ultimate goal of paralyzing the opposition through suspicion? Or would you stay silent and try to work around the penetration, knowing that silence meant the FSB maintained access to opposition networks? There's no clean answer here, which is exactly why this operation was so brilliantly designed. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because I'm genuinely curious how you'd navigate that impossible choice. Let's look at what happened next, because the story of Trust 2 doesn't end with its partial exposure. By 2010, some elements of the operation had been identified and disrupted, but the FSB had always planned for exposure. They'd built the operation in layers, with compartmentalized cells that didn't connect to each other. When one layer was compromised, the others continued operating. More importantly, the FSB had successfully tested and refined techniques that would be deployed in new contexts. The gatekeeper asset methodology proved so effective that it became standard FSB practice for targeting diaspora communities beyond just Chechens. Circassian, Tatar, and other ethnic minority exile groups in Europe all started experiencing similar penetration patterns. The academic ghostwriting operations expanded. More FSB illegals were placed in research institutions across Europe, not just studying Russia, but studying European security policy, NATO strategy, and democratic resilience. The intelligence collection was valuable, but the narrative-shaping capability was even more valuable. When Russia invaded Georgia in 2008 and later annexed Crimea in 2014, FSB-influenced academic voices were already positioned in European think tanks and universities, ready to offer nuanced perspectives that muddied public understanding of Russian aggression. The noise cloaking technique, where assets deliberately appeared somewhat incompetent, became standard tradecraft for FSB illegals. Western counterintelligence had been trained to look for highly professional operatives who never made mistakes. The FSB adapted by creating personas that made small, realistic mistakes while still accomplishing their intelligence objectives. One innovation from Trust 2 that became particularly important was what FSB documents called volunteer siphons. The FSB created front NGOs that offered attractive international volunteer programs focused on cultural exchange, youth leadership, or environmental protection. These programs attracted idealistic young Russians and Europeans who wanted to make a difference. The programs themselves were genuine. The volunteers really did plant trees, teach English, or organize cultural festivals. But the selection process was designed as a massive screening operation. Every applicant's background was checked, their social media was analyzed, their motivations were assessed. Those identified as having potential for recruitment were steered toward specific programs. Those identified as potential troublemakers were rejected or steered toward programs where they could be monitored. The FSB also refined their courthouse observation operations. Civic observers attending trials of Russian activists were actually FSB operatives collecting emotional vulnerability indicators. How did the defendant react to testimony? Which family members attended? Who seemed strong and who seemed close to breaking? This emotional intelligence informed later recruitment approaches and neutralization operations. Perhaps the most chilling innovation was the emotional volatility scoring system, a pre-social media algorithm that the FSB developed internally. Before Facebook and Twitter made emotional analysis easy through post history and interaction patterns, the FSB created manual assessment protocols for ranking dissidents by emotional stability, impulsivity, and vulnerability to manipulation. Officers would collect information from multiple sources: surveillance reports, informant observations, communications intercepts, public statements, and score individuals on various psychological metrics. High volatility scores meant someone was susceptible to provocation, could be easily manipulated into making mistakes, or might be vulnerable to recruitment through emotional appeals rather than material incentives. This system later evolved into the sophisticated social media analysis tools that Russian intelligence services now use, but it started as a Trust 2 initiative focused on mapping opposition psychology. The long-term impact of Trust 2 extended far beyond its operational lifespan. The techniques tested between 2000 and 2010 became standard Russian intelligence practice. When Putin launched his full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and hundreds of thousands of Russians fled the country, creating the largest Russian emigration since the 1920s, observers immediately noted the parallels. Dmitry Savin, editor of the Riga-based Russian conservative outlet Harbin, published an analysis in 2022 warning that Putin was deploying trust-style operations against the new exile opposition. FSB groups were being established to penetrate, hamstring, and ultimately discredit émigrés opposed to Putin's regime, just as had been done to earlier waves of opposition. The trust dynamics had evolved. Modern FSB operations sometimes openly acknowledged their government connections, operating in the murky space of plausible deniability rather than complete concealment. This approach worked because the information environment had become so complex and paranoia-inducing that even transparent operations could function effectively. If an opposition group admits it receives some Russian government funding for cultural programs, but insists it maintains editorial independence on political matters, should exiles trust it? If a coordinator has family in Russia but has been critical of Putin in public statements, should they be given sensitive information? The ambiguity itself served FSB interests. Western intelligence services tried to develop countermeasures. The CIA and MI6 shared Trust II case studies with European allies, teaching them to recognize gatekeeper penetration patterns, financial flow irregularities, and narrative shaping operations. Some Ukrainian and Baltic intelligence services became quite sophisticated at detecting Russian influence operations, having lived with them longer than Western services. But the fundamental challenge remained unchanged. Democratic societies, with open discourse, freedom of association, and protection of privacy, created enormous attack surfaces for operations like Trust II. Authoritarian services willing to be patient could almost always find ways to penetrate opposition movements operating in democratic spaces. The asymmetry was stark. Russian intelligence could recruit Europeans and Russian exiles through traditional incentives like money, kompromat, ideological manipulation, or family pressure. Western services had far less leverage over Russians living in Russia, and they operated under legal and ethical constraints that Russian services simply ignored. The original Operation Trust achieved its ultimate goal in 1927, when exposure destroyed the émigré opposition's ability to organize. Operation Trust II achieved similar results between 2008 and 2010, when partial exposure created the paranoia and suspicion that neutralized opposition effectiveness. The real question is whether Trust III is already operating, whether the opposition movements that exist today, both inside Russia and in the diaspora, are genuine grassroots resistance or carefully managed FSB operations designed to identify and neutralize real dissidents while creating the illusion of permitted opposition. This is the strategic brilliance of the trust methodology. Once you know the technique exists, you can never be entirely certain you are not living inside it. Every opposition leader becomes suspect. Every funding source becomes potentially compromised. Every new volunteer becomes a possible FSB plant. The ghost of Felix Dzerzhinsky doesn't just haunt the Lubyanka archives, it haunts every dissident who wonders whether their secure communications are truly secure, whether their trusted coordinator is truly trustworthy, whether their opposition movement is genuine resistance or a FSB-controlled honeypot. If you've made it this far, thank you for taking this journey through one of the most sophisticated counterintelligence operations of the modern era. This channel is dedicated to bringing you real spy stories every single day, operations that shaped history, tradecraft that defined the profession, and the human cost behind every intelligence success and failure. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time. Hit that button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. The world of intelligence operations is endlessly complex and endlessly fascinating, and we've barely scratched the surface of what happened in the shadows of the post-Soviet era. But this story isn't quite over yet. There's one final revelation about Operation Trust II that brings everything into focus. Remember Dmitry Volkov, the fake activist who penetrated that Riga NGO workshop in 2004. His handler's report from that operation was filed in FSB archives and marked for long-term retention. The psychological profiles he developed, the social network maps he created, the vulnerability assessments he compiled, all of it was entered into databases that would follow his targets for years. Marina Kozlov, the Open Society activist who revealed so much about her funding stress during that wine-fueled evening conversation, appeared in FSB files repeatedly over the next decade. In 2007, she was approached by someone offering to help streamline her NGO's reporting processes. In 2011, she received a grant from what appeared to be a Scandinavian foundation, but was actually a FSB front. In 2014, after Russia's annexation of Crimea, she was one of hundreds of activists whose communications were swept up in expanded FSB surveillance, and her earlier vulnerability profiles were used to craft targeted approaches. She never knew that a single weekend in Riga had marked her for permanent FSB attention. She never knew that the helpful young man asking thoughtful questions had been a FSB officer. She never knew that the Warsaw coordinator she'd trusted for years had been feeding her information to Russian intelligence. In 2019, Marina left Russia for Germany, part of the wave of activists fleeing increasing repression. In 2023, she attended a conference of Russian opposition activists in Berlin. Sitting 3 rows behind her was a middle-aged man who asked perceptive questions about how to organize effective resistance while maintaining operational security. She didn't recognize him. Why would she? She'd met him briefly 19 years earlier at a training workshop in Riga, and he'd been young then, and she'd been focused on other things. But his handler's after-action report noted her attendance and cross-referenced it with the 2004 files. The fake Dmitry Volkov had become the fake Alexei Petrov, and he was running the same operation against a new generation of opposition activists using the exact same playbook. So, what do you think? Was Operation Trust II justified from an intelligence perspective, or did it cross ethical lines that even intelligence services should respect? Could the operation have been handled differently by either the FSB or Western services trying to counter it? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I'm genuinely interested in how you see the moral calculus of operations like this. The trust files that Felix Dzerzhinsky created sit in the Lubyanka's special archives, their complexity defying analysis even a century later. The Trust II files are presumably being compiled right now, documenting operations that won't be fully understood for decades. And somewhere in Moscow, FSB officers are studying both sets of files, learning the lessons, refining the techniques, and preparing the next iteration. The operation never ended. It just evolved. The Ghost Network grows, one trusted coordinator at a time, one helpful volunteer at a time, one opposition movement at a time. And the activists it targets move through their days believing they're fighting for democracy, never quite certain whether the person sitting next to them is a fellow dissident or the latest version of Alexander Yakushev, playing a role that Felix Dzerzhinsky wrote a century ago. That's the true legacy of Operation Trust II, not the specific penetrations or the particular successes, but the permanent injection of doubt into opposition movements. The knowledge that it happened means it could be happening. The knowledge that exposure served FSB interests means exposure solves nothing. The knowledge that the playbook exists means the playbook is probably being used. Marina Kozlov sits in her Berlin apartment, working on another grant application, trusting another coordinator, building another network. And somewhere in the FSB's archives, her file gets another entry. The machine that Dzerzhinsky built and Putin perfected continues its patient work, invisible and unstoppable, controlled opposition masquerading as genuine resistance, ghost network serving ghost interests, the trust that never died operating under new names with the same old purpose. The game continues, the watchers watch, and nobody knows for certain which side they're really on.